Welcome to this fifth interview for the Enlightened Enterprise Academy's Salon series, Inflection. In the first interview, Indy Johar explained how we must get beyond our delusions and recognize that we're on a path to mutually assured destruction, so that we can start to think about how we might get ourselves onto a path to mutually assured flourishing instead. In the second interview, Lord Alderdice spoke of saving ourselves from ourselves and the need to overcome conflict and establish enough trust to be able to cooperate to effectively address our challenges. We then heard from Donna Hicks that leading with dignity requires us to be more conscious of our own dignity and the dignity of others. This is how we'll overcome conflict and improve our relationships with one another. And in the last interview with Neil Hawkes, we explored his work on values-based education in schools around the world, so that future generations might have the knowledge and the vocabulary to use effectively in their relationships with themselves and with each other. This interview with Mary Crossan continues the story by explaining and exploring ways in which leadership character can be developed in ourselves and in others, in our businesses, in teams, in organizations, in communities, and in nations. And in a world that seems to have many poor leaders, I think this interview will give you a sense of hope that there are solutions. Mary Crossan is a professor of strategic leadership and character research at the Ivey Business School, Western University, Ontario, Canada. She's also the co-author of a number of books, including Developing Leadership Character, and she consults to businesses and other organizations across a wide range of sectors and has done so for several decades now. Her company also offers training, tools, and learning apps that help make her advice practical and applicable, and she offers case studies that show that the work she does proves to be effective. Okay, welcome, Mary.
Oh, well, Paul, it's great to be here, and I have to acknowledge from the get-go, I'm a bit embarrassed that it took us as long as it did to get into character. So for me, I've been a professor at the Ivey Business School now for coming up to 4 decades now. My area of focus was strategic agility, renewal, innovation, learning, and it wasn't until 2008 that at the time I was leading an institute, leadership institute, and it became apparent with the global financial crisis that there were failures of leadership. And at that time, myself and my colleagues did these focus groups around the world. We wrote this monograph that's available through the Ivey leadership website called Leadership on Trial. And it really documents what were the conversations in those focus groups around the world. And at that time, leaders were talking about organizations that failed, had really poor decision making, and organizations that did well. And the piece that was coming out was character. They kept talking about character as being important. Now, here was the problem. There was every definition of character out there with respect to how these executives were thinking about character and how it influenced decision making. And so then they also debated whether or not character could be developed. Many believe that you're born with character, or it's determined by the time you're 5. And so since 2008 has really been our time where we were leaning in to try to understand. And here's a really important, I think, point for listeners. Our aspiration was to elevate character alongside competence in higher education and organizations. So we wanted to do, a robust enough approach to understanding character that it could stand up against, if you want to call it, the science and practice of competence, so that it could align with it in organizations and education.
Most people would probably agree that character is important, but like you just said, they may struggle to try to define exactly what it is and exactly why it's important. So can I ask you if you can share what your definition of character is, and can you explain why you think it matters so much?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lengthy definition of it that we have in an article just published in Academy of Management Learning and Education, which really denotes the facets of character, that it's an interconnected suite of embodied habits, for example, that are virtuous in their orientation, and that they can be assessed and developed, and that they can operate in both a deficient and excess vice state. Now, when we're talking with lay people about it, we really talk about character as a habit of being. You know, there's a prescriptive sense about what character is. We know what it looks like in its virtuous state. What becomes more interesting about understanding character as this habit of being is to be able to diagnose who have we become while we've been busy living with respect to character. And it's interesting. A lot of people ask us because we talk about leader character a lot, but that was largely to differentiate character from its common usage that was emerging, for example, in psychology, focused on well-being. And there are some tweaks that you have to do when you're beginning to understand character as applied in organizations. So we started to augment the word character with leader character. But for us, leader is about the disposition to lead, not the position of leadership. And when we're working particularly with executives, many who have kids, we say, imagine, you're a teenager and you as a parent, what are you really doing with your kids? You're fostering, hopefully, character. And many have said to us, thanks, that I now have a roadmap on how to parent. But if you think about the disposition to lead for a teenager today in a world of 24/7 social media, my goodness, they're going to need strength of character to help understand who they are in the midst of a lot of social pressures that are trying to define them in a particular way.
I'm going to throw in an extra question here. Some corporations have long kind of understood why character is important. If you're familiar with the book on what went wrong at Goldman Sachs, character in that particular case was considered for a very, very long time more important than capabilities, competencies, and so on in hiring people. And I remember reading the book, and it was a change in the practice as the company became so very rapidly expanding. They couldn't continue the usual hiring processes that they'd went through previously because they were time consuming and so on. And so the author of the book, who was a former company insider, said that it was that made things go wrong and that led to, well, that was what went wrong at Goldman Sachs, was basically stopping focusing on hiring for character. And do you think, I don't know if you've read the book or not, but I mean, broadly speaking, is that in line with what you're finding?
I haven't read the book, but I can say to you, I just wrote a piece in Forbes on Boeing. And the idea was, with it, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, is that I wrote that the fault lines that existed in Boeing to create a lot of the tragic consequences of failures of decision making, those fault lines are in every organization, Goldman included. So I think what's interesting for me is that when we bring the science of character to actually understand what is going on in organizations, what happens about our misunderstanding about what character is that can create imbalances in individuals. And then that just finds its way into things like our selection and promotion practices, which then find their way into culture of organizations. And so you get this, complex set of fault lines that are all stemming from a misunderstanding about character. So we've got a study underway because I do a lot of work with the Canadian military. And this particular study looks at, the 5 I's and how Canada, US, the UK New Zealand, Australia, in their leadership doctrine, how they are defining character, how are they describing character. And we use the science that we've emerged around what should character look like in organizations to identify the fact that even in military organizations, which have really prided themselves in character, we have a lot of imbalances that are being promoted in the organization. And so the DNA essentially gets thrown off, right, about what character is. Now, let's just pick up that, the science of character helps us understand that is both universal. It across cultures, across time, even across religions, we can establish that there are certain dimensions of character that matter. The problem is different sectors, different areas end up tending to emphasize some over others. And that's what really gets us into difficulty in organizations. So I do also work in professional sports. Can you imagine there? There's, for example, a lot of overweighting on things like drive, like being very results oriented. And yet, even in professional organizations, sports organizations, they realize, having a lot of drive without a lot of strength and humility or humanity actually it can compromise performance, both short-term and long-term performance. So what I'm finding is there's this aha moment in many places where people thought they understood character, where they're beginning to see it in a different light.
The question that popped into my mind as you were speaking then is that I guess the goal isn't to try to hire the same kind of characters. You don't want everybody in the organization to have the same kind of character. You want a mixture, and I guess it depends also function and the role the person has in the organization as well. Is that true?
Well, Paul, we get that question a lot, and the answer is no. So here, let me explain why. I think the reason we get the question a lot is that the approach that we've had to leadership, to competencies, to background, experience, et cetera, is to be able to have complementarity and diversity, which is very true. You do want that in some areas. When it comes to character, you don't want diversity. We're going to maybe talk a little bit later about these 11 dimensions of character. It's like the anatomy and physiology of the body. And we have to start with understanding how it resides within us, because those imbalances that will appear, I can have strengths in some areas, you can have strengths in others, but the only time they're going to be complementary is when we're on the call talking. But I have a life outside of that where my imbalances of character are going to manifest in a particular way. And the important part about this is that why would we live with these imbalances when the opportunity to strengthen these dimensions of character are available to us? I often get the examples of people looking at prominent individuals like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, and they see, what are imbalances of character. And sometimes they confuse the fact that they go, oh, well, they're very successful individuals. So, doesn't that negate the point that character matters? I say about that, there's several important facets of this. We think about episodes of decision making. And anybody can look at both Musk and Jobs and say, man, there are episodes of decision making that have been very poor for both of them that you could identify as not relating to competence, but as relating to character. So what we're trying to do is improve those episodes of poor decision making of leaders to say, you don't want to diminish, let's say in a Steve Jobs, his courage and his transcendence that really fostered a lot of innovation, but you would say, boy, let's strengthen that humility, humanity, and collaboration that might have mitigated some of the negative outcomes. So that's number one. Number two, we can often find that there are extensive, what economists typically call externalities of these episodes of decision making. So that while they might be privileging some people in terms of the effectiveness of the decision in some results at some point in time, they actually end up being negative consequences for others. That's the global financial crisis in a nutshell, right? There was a period of time where people benefited from it, and then lots of people don't. So sometimes we get these ticking time bombs in the what appear to be financial results of an organization. And so again, we'd say, why would any individual or organization want to incur that risk of decision making when these are things that we can develop and should develop?
So I think I understand where you're going and what you're saying here, but I'm also reminded of the fact that boards usually get criticized for having people on the board that are, too much alike each other in many ways. And headhunting firms that recruit senior executives and directors to boards tend to be owned and run by former directors and senior executives, recommending people based on their assessment of character. But I wonder whether you've actually looked at that area and I'm guessing you're aware of that criticism. I wonder how that relates to what you've just said.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to go back to what we want diversity on. So we want diversity of background, of experience, around perspective. There's an and strength of character. So I think it's people often misunderstanding, well, what is character?
Yeah.
So where and how is it developed? So the fact is, we can develop character quite a bit differently, and it is rooted in our background. Sometimes I joke that, around the dimension of collaboration, I grew up in a family, 8 brothers and sisters. I shared a room with 2 of my sisters for most of my life. My cultivation of collaboration is fundamentally shaped, right, by my experiences of growing up in a large family where lots of other people were invited into the home. Grandmother lived with us. Several cousins lived with us over periods of time, and that shapes the DNA of my character in a particular way. Now, somebody else's story around how they cultivated and what their collaboration is, or where it comes from, or the cultural background, like that is what we want to pick up. Like that's the gold. And character is unique to the individual, even though we understand what these dimensions of character are. And in my case, we wouldn't want to be overweighting, for example, my strength in collaboration because I don't have actual maybe strength and accountability that needs to support that collaborative muscle.
So what you've just said, I think, actually gets me back onto the questions I was planning to ask before we started going off. So I was going to say, I guess that people would associate the concept of character with values, virtues, ethics, and moral standards. And I wonder if you could just explain what the relationship is between character and these concepts.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks. That is a very important question. Of course, character has its foundations in virtue ethics, and it's probably one of the most ancient areas of study, right? Going back to Confucius, Aristotle, Plato. And philosophers today have done a great job of being able to bring those concepts into the modern day. Now, what my experience has been is there often can be a gap, which we wrote in our Academy of Management Learning and Education article. We can have cross-disciplinary and cross-field gaps about what understanding what character is. So when we came at character from a business school standpoint, right, we have a responsibility for understanding character in organizations. Well, most philosophers, as they come at it and looking at virtues and morals, they've got a kind of a different perspective about how that they're doing it. And then if we think about, we wrote this cross-field piece about research, teaching, and practice. And so if we're just, thinking about writing about character and we're not thinking about how to apply it in organizations, we can find ourselves fairly siloed about understanding what it is. So that's a long-winded introduction to say we have found ourselves in closing the gap and building on the work of philosophers, which then came through psychologists like Martin Seligman, the former president of the American Psychological Association, wrote this book in 2004, Character, Strengths, and Virtues, really beginning to bring character into the sphere of observable behavior, which, by the way, for philosophers, that's a bit troubling because a lot of character is around intention, right intention. And what we land on the side of saying, yep, sure, right intention, but we really have to be accountable for observable behavior because there is a gap between, people's and good intentions and the fact that their behaviors don't really exemplify that. So that then gets us into, in practice, we have actually distanced ourselves more from the moral and ethical side of character because what we found as we began working in this space and back in 2008 is it shortchanged what character was and how it could be applied, because it isn't just about being a good person or making moral and ethical decisions, is that it is a foundation for both well-being and sustained excellence. So we can take care of the moral and ethical side, but we do want to be thinking about how do we have, the practical wisdom that Aristotle talked about, great judgment and decision-making. So the first piece that I'd like to pick up is that while we like to honor that tradition of virtue ethics and moral and ethical decision-making, we actually come at it a different way and really make the case about the sustained excellence that arises from character. And I'll just share with you some of the key findings. Of course, you've got Fred Keel's work, Return on Character, talking about 5 times return on assets for leaders with strong character. Our particular research has been showing a 14% increase in leader effectiveness between weak and strong character. Think about things like psychological safety, which are hugely important constructs in organizations, 16% improvement, 18% improvement in employee voice. So character matters deeply. And another piece I'd like to bridge around the notion of ethical decision-making and decision-making is that most decisions don't come packaged with an ethical bow around them. What we can see often is this slippery slope of decision making that ends up, in hindsight, one looks at and go, how the heck did they make that decision? Like, it's just egregious. But what we want to try to pick up is the micro moments of decision, great decision making. Landed, of course, that's the background of virtue ethics in the strength of character of the individual who makes the decision. You also asked about values. And I think this is really important because, in my field, in organizations, in education, we put, so much emphasis on values. If only we have the right values, we'll get the right behaviors. But we've seen every organization, for example, value integrity. And the way we look at that is, it's like telling somebody to run a marathon and not train for it. Valuing integrity doesn't mean we're going to be people who have strength of integrity. And even then, not understanding what integrity is from a character standpoint and how it aligns with other dimensions of character. So I'll give you an example. We look at the behaviors of integrity, being authentic, candid, consistent, principled, transparent. So those behaviors are tough to develop in and of themselves. But if we have that strength and integrity, but low humility that goes along with it, we actually set up the conditions that we have for many leaders today where they're principled, but they're their principles. They're candid, but they're just belligerent about how they deal with things. They lack humanity, they lack justice, they lack accountability, but they stand on integrity, right? They stand on, I'll tell you exactly what I think. And we haven't been able to course correct around that because we value integrity, but we actually haven't understood the character, for example, that's got to underpin it.
Most people struggle to define several of the terms that we've used so far, character, values, virtues, and so on. So we need to get the definitions right. We need to know what their characteristics are, and we need to keep them in balance. All that requires a much greater level of consciousness about what character is and why it's important than is generally held by most people. You know, when I interviewed Donna Hicks about leading with dignity, she talks about dignity consciousness. In that context, I'm wondering whether it might be, whether we can talk about character consciousness as well.
We could, and what I'm going to suggest to you that it's got to go deeper than that, because what you're picking up, first of all, at the very beginning, is there isn't a literacy around character. Imagine if we couldn't read or write. Imagine the education that we put into maths and sciences day after day, year after year, on the competence side of things. So let's imagine, which is, and I have to credit my daughter, Corey Crossan, who is a teaching and research fellow at Oxford, at the Oxford Character Project. She did her PhD in kinesiology, bringing exercise science to the development of character. So the one I'm about to talk about is really coming and stemming from the perspective of exercise science. So imagine we have to exercise a consciousness, and imagine that this isn't just about knowing that somebody listens to this podcast and reads up on the 11 dimensions of character and could recite what those words are, and could even begin to recite the deficient and excess states. What I like about Corey's approach to it is, talking about going to the character gym. And here we then begin to understand the paradigm shift that we need. It's not good enough just to know these ideas. What are we doing every single day to begin to exercise our character? And she once said to me, which really shifted my understanding of it, she says, it's very hard to stay as you are physically. We're either deteriorating or we're strengthening. And imagine if we actually understand with our character that we're not standing still. Something is happening. We could be becoming somebody with less humility. And of course, studies of leadership have shown that as leaders rise in organizations for lots of different reasons, their humility atrophies, right? So we can counteract that force. It's like counteracting aging in terms of your physical development. So we ask ourselves, who are we becoming while we're busy doing? And then begin to ask, what are we doing every single day to actually take that knowledge of understanding what character is and strengthening it? So it might be helpful for listeners to think about, we look at a continuum of character development, of which that consciousness part is a first step. It is, how do we get that literacy? How do we actually understand what character is to even give ourselves a chance? It's like, think about your core muscles of your body. Once you know what they are, you can learn to activate core muscles, but you actually have to do the work of activating them to develop core strength. So the second step we talk about is priming, reminding, and reinforcement to activate. And there's a lot of work we know how to do around activating on character. And think about the fact that without back to conscious attention to understanding how your character is activated, could be deactivated. Reward systems in organization often may deactivate the courage or accountability of individuals around good judgment and decision making. We want people's strength of character to withstand some of the negative activation on their character, and we want to insert within that on a daily basis, strengthening it. So, for example, we use music to activate character consciously. We have a Spotify playlist that looks at those 11 dimensions of character and says, okay, let me feel what that feels like to activate on courage. Let me use the music itself to inspire me around that. Then if we go to the next step, we think about, well, we got to strengthen that muscle. So it's more than just activating. What am I going to do every single day to actually strengthen the muscle of character? The fourth stage is understanding how that relates to other dimensions of character. And here's the piece, Paul, that I just think most of us don't get to. The fifth stage is understanding how that character holds up under different contexts, like time pressure, you know, like competing values, like understanding, when our health is suffering. That's a big one for me. I just find like, man, I miss not showing up as my best self, and lack of sleep, you name it. Where is it that our character doesn't hold up for us?
Yeah, and sometimes we are not conscious of the fact that, we are being negatively influenced by something else. So again, comes back to being conscious of that to begin with, I guess. Going to the character gym. Um, so it's kind of exercising the mind and consciousness around what we mean by character. That's really what you're getting at, yeah?
Well, the product that we actually developed around this is called Virtuosity. And what we did is embed within it the science of habit development. So many people know James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. And it's really interesting to understand that there's actually a science of learning a habit. It's not an easy thing. So this is, I find, fascinating because, you go back to values, you go back to things like dignity. How do we become that person? What is it that I need to do every single day to do that? First of all, people don't know. They don't have an architecture for what it is that they could be developing. They don't know what exercises to do. They don't know necessarily how to reflect on those exercises. So what we tried to do within the Virtuosity app is really provide all of the science in the background that enables people that architecture to take an exercise every single day that helps them take 5 minutes a day. This is usually the way we think about it. Unlike the physical gym that's going to take you an hour or an hour and a half, character is, first thing in the morning, usually we look at morning coffee to look at something in the app to see what your exercise is. Mine today, I'm working on appreciative under transcendence, and I'm in the activate stage. So it's about identifying a quote today that might activate on my appreciative behavior in transcendence. So, that's about like 5 minutes, but that piece it's like I'm on the lookout, right? I'm thinking about throughout the day, where is that appreciative behavior in my day? Couple of minutes at the end of the day with a structured reflection on where was it in my day. And, that's what we're talking about with respect to the nature of character development. Now, we find, Paul, that, of course, certain people don't have access necessarily to the app, or that's not the way they want to go. I really credit, again, Corey, a lot of work that she does on social media. She puts out a lot of stuff that if you just followed that on LinkedIn, on Instagram, where she's got exercises that she posts for people. So that's the thing, is we want to get this in the front of the mind of individuals so that character is now in the foreground, not in the background.
An extra question again here. So how helpful would it be, for example, to try to understand the character traits in relation to somebody that you know and admire, a role model or a mentor, for example?
That's a very important approach. So both Oxford and Wake Forest, they developed these 7 strategies around character formation, and understanding exemplars is an important facet of that. By the way, I'd say exemplars and cases of which this is not a good exemplar, because we learn as much from strength as we do from weakness. So even in the app, we have a lot of videos and things like that, but these are naturally available to us every single day. And Paul, I don't think it's just looking at exemplars. It would be about, in our day-to-day interactions, can we become students of character? Can we begin to understand that? And I think it's hugely important. Think about coaching and mentoring, working, whether it would be your kids or your colleagues or your subordinates. most of us have not really had the benefit of guidance around character development, or we have in some way. I go back to my upbringing. I think the reason I probably identified with character very quickly is both my parents had incredibly strong character, and yet, I look at my mom, who probably had, some big imbalances, incredible transcendence and courage and drive and accountability, low temperance, in the language that we would have now. And, I look back, she ended up having a stroke late in life, and I'm pretty sure that that was probably a result of the imbalances. That if we now I can look at these things, and I can look at individuals, and I can understand my own upbringing and background to say, what would have been cultivated in me as an individual, and now how might I shape that now that I have a better understanding about what character is.
Just thinking there are plenty of leaders out there at the moment. Um, I can think of more bad exemplars than good ones right now, but looking at them is a way of trying to understand the different character traits and what they
Yes, and
mean.
if I could just add, because I think sometimes we're privileging this sort of hero mentality, but one of the things that is a very, a big practice that we use in the app that people can do all the time is noticing it in your daily life. There's plenty of people around us, and even though we might not have people we would see as strength and character in all dimensions, a lot of times you're asked about a particular behavior. So while I mentioned I'm on the second stage of appreciative, the first stage is really for me to have identified how I've seen appreciative operate in its deficient and excess state in people around me and in myself. So there's a lot of work that's just available to us that we don't have to look at, exemplars or others, but really just take advantage of what's available to us in daily life.
Yeah, so exemplars could be, or bad exemplars could be exemplars because they're deficient or because they've taken a character trait to the extreme. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And, Paul, I want to reinforce a point that I made earlier, but this is hugely important. We never want to diminish a strength.
Hmm.
It is looking for the other dimensions of character to support it. I remember working with an executive group who was an assistant deputy minister, and she says, like, the light bulb went on for her because she had kept getting this idea from people, you've got to tone yourself down, and she goes, I don't know what to do with that, like tone myself down. And she realized she's got a lot of drive and courage and transcendence. Probably she was a lot like my mom, in a lot of these characteristics. She also happened to have this extrovert kind of orientation. I said, you probably find you take the oxygen out of the room when you walk in. It's like you just bring this sort of force of energy into it. He said, if you were cultivating things like temperance, humility, humanity, collaboration, you would naturally find yourself in settings where you weren't having to tone yourself down, but you're just listening to others better than you have been in the past. That you were relating. If you look at collaboration, there's a behavior called interconnected, which is a fabulous behavior. How do you become interconnected with another human being? And if you are interconnected with them, it's not about toning yourself down, but it's about trying to understand where they're coming from and how it is you relate to them. And you get this sort of symbiotic kind of relationship. And she was like, oh my gosh, it's just like the light bulb went on. She doesn't have to
Yeah.
tone herself down. She just has to build some of these muscles that were underdeveloped.
Well, one of the things that kind of stood out in your model, which we'll come to shortly, is that each of the character traits has what's almost an opposite to help bring about the kind of balance. Can you maybe just illustrate one or two of those?
Yeah, I can. So, maybe walk around these 11 dimensions. And for those, trying to visualize it, there are 10 in a constellation, and judgment is in the middle, or what Aristotle called practical wisdom. each of these 11 dimensions have a set of observable behaviors that are all a little different, but they align around that particular area. So the constellation is, we have transcendence and drive, collaboration, humanity, humility, integrity, temperance, accountability, justice, and courage. I think I got them all. And that, of course, judgment in the middle. So I'll use myself as an example. I think a lot of people tend to relate to this one fairly well. Around judgment, there's a word, decisive. It is important as you're pulling all of these dimensions of character together. There's a capacity that we have to make sense of things, and there's justice. So there's all of these pieces that are pulling and pulling. Aristotle's practical wisdom was, how do we, resolve those? And we need to resolve those. Often we don't have a month or a year to necessarily make a resolution. So in my case, decisiveness is the virtuous state, right? But if we look at the deficient state, it's indecisive. The excess state is impulsive. We often ask people on this list, deficient and excess, it's like walking on a balance beam. What's your lean? Is your lean to the left, to the deficient, to the right, or is it a two-way lean, which is a more complicated one? In my case on decisive, it's a rare moment where I'm indecisive, which tells me my lean is to the excess state. I do not describe myself as impulsive, yet I can absolutely see how somebody else would. Absolutely. And on what basis would they think about that? Well, if they don't see my humanity, my humility, my temperance, if those are not showing up, then it just becomes, Mary didn't listen. She never listens. She's always ready to just, pull the trigger on something. And, so the thing is around my decisiveness, I don't want to diminish it, but to your question about, it's not just one opposing dimension of character. There might be several that one needs to think about with respect to strengthening. And they're usually ones that are on your list of weaker areas. And in my case, temperance, humanity, and in spite of the fact that I grew up in a big family, collaboration can also become a bit of a sticking point for me.
You just touched on another really important point about consciousness here, I think, because being conscious of how others might perceive you is really important way of understanding why you need to sort of try and balance your tendencies. But quite often people don't have that level of consciousness. They don't realize how they're being perceived by others.
You're absolutely right. And research supports that. Tasha Eurich's work around self-awareness shows that 85% of us believe we're self-aware and only 10% are. So what I like about the character work, it gives us a roadmap to begin to understand what am I going to be self-aware on, because we can be self-aware about so many things, right? It's like it's an endless list. What I like is bringing some reflection to these. We think about character like at the roots of the tree system. It's so foundational that if we could keep our eye on an awareness and self-awareness of these 11 dimensions of character and their behaviors, that will go a long, long way. Now, the second part of that is that we judge ourselves on our intention and others on their behavior. So you can begin to see why we started to move away from the philosophical point of view around it, right intention. And, my experience around the development of character is that through that accountability for your observable behavior, you begin to understand your intention and the gap between your intention and behavior. I don't want to be somebody who's impulsive. My intention is not to be that person. The piece I want to be accountable for is the observable behavior around it. So what we do find in this notion about going to the character gym it begins to be that cultivation of understanding. You see it in others, you see it in yourself. We include in the app a partnership, so that, for example, Corey is my partner in the app, and every week I'll get her assessment of what I've been working on that week, and we'll have a discussion about what I saw in myself, what she saw. There are self 360 assessments of character, Sigma assessment systems that we partnered with way back to help organizations get into this space, because you're right, Paul, it's not something that a lot of people are really good at understanding for themselves.
Okay, well, I want to take us back to the conversation around capabilities and around character. Well, in the last interview that I did in the series with Neil Hawkes, it was quite apparent in the conversation with him that schools teach capabilities and less about character. And I think most universities do the same. Probably they teach even less about character. Although I know that after the 2007-8 crisis, many business schools started looking at ethics and maybe touched on character and so on at that time. But do you think this focus on teaching capabilities rather than character explains why employers tend to hire for capabilities, not character? Or is it the other way around? Is it that because organizations hire for capabilities, schools and universities focus on teaching capabilities? And I wonder why, despite its importance, why is it that character doesn't get the attention and respect that it warrants?
Mm-hmm.
That's quite a long question, and there's bits
No,
and
it's a great question. And return to the aspiration we had in 2008. We wanted to elevate character alongside competencies, recognizing that competencies have a stranglehold on education and organization. And competencies, so we have a manuscript that looks at an empirical count of character and competencies and how they predict promotion potential. And in that, we pick up the history around the competency work. Knowledge, skills, abilities, right, is the area of competencies. And you can understand why it took hold, right? We've got a lot of knowledge that has emerged that I look at my experience over 40 years at the business school, and the amount of knowledge that we have today that gets stuffed into education that we begin to privilege as being really important. So we understand why there's been that kind of shift around both in education and in organizations, knowledge, skills, and abilities. Interesting, on the competency side, there's this other category that got moved in. And so some people actually listening to this would say, yeah, well, we cover that. Like, we have courage under our competency framework. And I want to pick up, Paul, that there's a lot of danger. The research that we've seen around competencies is that, picking little bits of character and treating them as a competency is a very dangerous space. One, we don't understand the interconnection of the dimensions of character. We miss all sorts of ones. We treat it as a competency as opposed to a habit of development. So that's a piece that's important to understand. And I did see the podcast that you were referring to, and what I maybe people might like this visual where we talk about the tree system with character as the roots of the tree system, competencies like the branches and leaves on the tree. So character, elevating character alongside competencies is really important. In my field, I teach strategy, strategic competency, and I talk about the failures of strategy are rarely failures of competence and largely failures of character. So we understand the competency side, got that pretty good. And then we also think about values and culture like the trunk of the tree system. And what we forget is, even though we may label what we want in our values or define the aspirational culture of the organization, it will be a reflection of the character of the individuals in it. If it's a shallow root system when it comes to character, or there's imbalances, that will be the manifestation, right, of our values and our culture. So when you ask, with all of this knowledge that we now have about why we're not course correcting around this, that's the Academy Management Learning and Education article that we just published, which is because we won an award in 2013 for the article we had published on developing leader character. So we were doing this sort of decade review to say, well, what have we learned, or what are we missing? It is controversial for me, perhaps for listeners, to say this, but it's a sobering fact that I do think if we continue to talk about character solely around values and ethics in the right thing to do, we're going to lose the battle on it. And it's actually a fairly dangerous battle, as we're already seeing playing out in the US. You see it playing out in the, in the EDI space, where, my gosh, in several fell swoops, this is all getting, tarnished with a brush of, we're not hiring competent people. We can't afford to be able to running, aviation with only diversity. Paul, I think this is a very sobering account of the fact that when we talk about character, we will hopefully, pick up good and right decisions. But where we want to pick it up is, it is around sustained excellence, and it's not at odds with having great competence. So first of all, we talk about we're going to need to switch the narrative if we, in organizations and in higher education, and we can, why would we be on the back foot and be trying to convey that it's just the right thing to do when in fact we've got stronger ground. A second thing I want to relay is, we find, and we wrote in that article, that one of the biggest impediments is the subject matter expertise of people who have a confidence to be able to navigate the character space. So I was working with a medical school, and the dean and the senior leaders were talking about hiring residents on the basis of character. And the dean said, he said to me, I've heard you speak so many times, and I know that this is something that we have to do, but it scares me. And then I said, well, would you go into surgery scared? And no, we would correct on competence, right, around what we would be afraid of in surgery. And I said, well, what this tells us is we're running with a blind spot on character. It's a risk factor in organizations. And the fact that we are not comfortable with what it is, how to develop it, how to embed it in our HR practices, tells us we don't know enough about it and we're flying blind on it. So we need to think about how are we going to get that subject matter expertise to embed it in our educational system.
Yeah, I guess the problem is that, the terms around character, value, ethics, and so on, they're all really quite sensitive terms and can provoke really strong emotional reactions, probably also due to the lack of knowledge about the terms and what they mean, and the importance of them, and so on as well. So an emotional reaction can sometimes be sort of defensive cover for that lack of knowledge. How would you recommend somebody begin a conversation about this without triggering? Because people are too easily triggered these days by various terms and words. Is there a way in which you can overcome that?
Yes, for sure. I actually think that character is the great way to go at it. And by the way, think about the word competency, even capability.
Yeah.
They get into our lexicon and we just go, okay, yeah, I understand that. Treating character in this role like the anatomy and physiology of the body, gets us into a space where we can kind of stand back and look at it. And the fact that we are saying, we're not going to come at it from a moral and ethics standpoint. The moral and ethics side, in my experience, gets taken care of as people work on these muscles of developing character. So they're working on muscles of justice and accountability and humility and humanity. And so, Paul, we've worked with, thousands of students, thousands of leaders about this, that, the first inclination of, oh, are you going to tell me what are the right morals and ethics and values? No, we're not. Because what we do know is that if you are working on these dimensions of character through that learning process, you begin to peel the onion and you begin to understand where you came from, what you have valued, what your core beliefs are. And as you begin to look at those things, we begin to see them differently through the lens of character. So I find that it's actually a really robust place to enter these conversations. And think about this, values and ethics. Again, for me, 40 years in strategy, that language has been there for the 40 years I've been there, and we're not moving the needle. I hate to say it, not moving the needle, and yet the world we live in has become even more complicated. So we can't return to the toolkit, that as the only toolkit that we've got. I don't mean to get rid of it. It's like we want it there, but we want to get to the roots of the tree system to say, if we want to move the needle, I love that comic strip. We've met the enemy and it is us. So how are we going to rewire ourselves? How are we going to, in our educational systems and organizations, equip people with a way of understanding the science of what character is and how it is that they can begin to develop it?
Yep, that makes sense.
Another piece I want to make mention of here, which I haven't as deeply as I should have, it's not only about sustained excellence, right? Having, decision making, action taking day in and day out. It's about our well-being. And what we find in organizations and in education, some of the highest rates that we're seeing now of burnout, of depression, of anxiety. And if you think about the development of character, it's probably, this cornerstone that helps us navigate those pieces better. I like this. We've got a podcast, by the way, called Question of Character podcast series. Anybody's interested. Many, many episodes talking about different facets of character, but one is about well-being. And we have a clinical psychologist who relays, which I quite like, a definition of anxiety in a numerator, overestimation of danger or threat, denominator, underestimation of our capacity to deal with it. And if you look at even something like the behaviors of transcendence, being future-oriented, inspired, optimistic, purpose, creative, appreciative, to me, it's like solar energy. It is, what is it that you're going to use in the day to fuel who you can become? Because you're going to need that, in this world that has, a lot of danger or threat, but also has opportunity. And how am I going to see that? If you look at something like temperance, being patient, calm, composed, prudent, self-controlled, how will you cultivate those behaviors? Again, to know that no matter what gets thrown your way, you're not going to be backed into a corner on it. You will find a way forward. Dealing, strengthening your collaboration, for example, being open-minded, flexible, cooperative, interconnected, collegial. It means you're not in this alone, right? It's this capacity to be able to open up and say, let's figure out a way forward on this. And so, Paul, I just wanted to, before we move on from the framework, it's not just something that's this two-dimensional framework. Yes, there's a science around character, but there's this art, a side of it that manifests itself as that root system to flourish all sorts of things that we've got. So it is the basis for human flourishing, which is where character first had its origins.
Again, you kind of harking back to consciousness, but it's reflecting on events and what went well, what went wrong as part of that consciousness exercise. So that I guess what you almost mentioned then was you can rehearse. If this happens again, I'm going to do this differently next time.
Yes, you can, and maybe this is a good place also to move us in the understanding of consciousness in this, you know, it isn't just knowing, and it isn't just knowing and intending to do something differently. In our work around character development, one of the things that we began to see a fair bit is rewiring who we are when it comes to character is more than a cognitive exercise.
Hmm.
So one of the things that people might find interesting, we have another episode about this on the question of character, is relying on cognitive behavioral therapy. Is that there are four big systems that underpin, this who we are: our physiology, our affect, which is feeling, emotions, and mood; cognition, which is what we usually focus on; and then our behavior itself. And so, what I find in the place of character development, we want to bring a better insight into what it actually takes to develop those systems. So, these are things that are also embedded in the app, right, where you begin to think about your physiology. Because we get into fight flight too quickly,
Hmm.
about things, right? If we haven't developed that particular system, even our affect, what we know from that particular research is that we label our emotions very poorly.
Hmm.
So think about somebody who's doing public speaking, and they go, I don't really have the courage to be able to do what I do. Well, so they, I'm afraid of it. Well, maybe they're actually excited.
Hmm.
Maybe the adrenaline state, part of what they're feeling is being in this state of uncertainty, unknown, and that, yeah, maybe there's fear over there, but there's a whole bunch of other things going on. Maybe they've got some sense of possibility about it, and they see that in that moment, there's a lot on the line, that they want to reach people. Maybe it's a whole bunch of things that are going on. Anyways, I'm using it as an example to say, as we develop character, as we develop that kind of consciousness about things, we want to also understand there's a big architecture of what it takes to rewire that consciousness that people, I think, underestimate.
You give the whole lexicon to the whole subject area, which is a good starting point. It helps people navigate a bit better. You recently published an article in Forbes magazine looking at the reasons AI needs character-based judgment. So this is very topical, but I found it really interesting to think and understand more about character by thinking of it in relation to AI. What you said is that the AI can adequately substitute for competence, but it can't replace character. So I wonder if you can just explain what you're getting at and share a couple of examples.
So, in that article, I talked about the fact my first, many, many years ago, somebody said to me, could you embed character in synthetic humans? So, this is taking AI to, this super intelligence idea that we will cultivate these synthetic humans who perceive the way we do, et cetera, et cetera. So it's one of your bigger challenges to say, all right, they're kind of a lot like us. It isn't just some machine, but what would it look like? How might a synthetic human, AI, really be better maybe at some aspects of character and not so good at others? Now, here is a very important facet, and I really like Valor's work on the AI mirror, is understanding that everything that is embedded in AI historically is a reflection of our character. So one of the first things I talk about in that article is to say, if we're thinking about AI as this massive repository that we rely on, we have to actually understand in what way it has embedded the deficiencies in character that we have already manifested. And if we actually understand our character, we can actually then maybe understand AI. That's number one. And then as we begin to explore all of the dimensions of character, you can begin to see that, if you look at something like under judgment being analytical, cognitively complex, there are facets we can look at AI that they're just, computationally all that much better than we're thinking about. But if we look at something like justice and the development of justice, what's fair, what's equitable, it isn't just a computational exercise. That we understand that. How do we cultivate, and if we think about AI and the decisions that could be generated through AI, in what way have they embodied character? And then I talked in that article a little bit about, like, even if you look at something like temperance, thinking about being patient or calm, very interesting, right? You would think about AI as being inherently patient and calm. It'll continue to, as you ask questions, respond, and hopefully in a nice way about it. But the fact is, there's an excess state of being patient or calm that is around, being detached, for example. One of the reasons that we lose our calm is because of those big PABC systems. Our physiology tells us there's an agitation about something and why. It gives us information about it. We have to work with that information. But where is that in any AI that tells us there's something that may be amiss in this particular piece? So in that article, I go through all of the dimensions of character and really talk about them in how we can think about them for ourselves and AI. A practical example is I'm just working up a strategy exercise for my executive MBAs. And the Ivey Business School is just going through, we have a new dean who's come in, and he's a strategy guy himself and is building, new strategy for the Ivey Business School. And if you think about, let's start with a human-centric approach to the development of strategy, and then let's look at an AI approach to the development of strategy. Of course, there's going to be some combination of the two, but we want to understand what is it how do they stand? And so I just did this exercise from an AI exercise, asking about the strategy of the business school and understanding competitive analysis and understanding sustainable competitive advantage. And of course, one of the things that we know about AI, it reverts to the mean. It doesn't give you that piece that is really novel. It's different. It relies on the judgment and decision-making of how it is that we can begin to think about that possibility for the business school. Number one, right? So we can do a lot of strategic analysis that way, but the actual judgment around adopting a strategy would be quite different. The other piece that we want to pick up on is that most things that matter in our organizations are human endeavor. So, what is the likelihood that our dean, who goes through some strategic analysis through AI, presents it to the business school, and all the constituents says, here's the strategy for the Ivey Business School? What is the likelihood that any of us are excited about that? What's the likelihood that any of us are engaged in that particular process? And so things like belonging, well-being, our character itself are not activated through those AI-generated solutions. So, Paul, those are just a few ways that we begin to think about AI.
Yeah, so the way I read it was that, effectively understanding AI's strengths and weaknesses in relation to the character traits helps us understand human strengths and weaknesses in relation to, well, the character traits, and ours in particular, our individual ones, I mean. It just for me, when I read the article, it just kind of made it kind of even more clear what the importance of each of the different character traits might be. Okay, let me move on to the next question. And I wanted to ask you about a recent article I wrote in which I quoted Deming as saying that a bad system will beat a good person every time. So that suggests that having good leadership character in any individual might not be enough. And I wonder if that perhaps explains the high levels of staff turnover, lack of engagement, and so on. Why they so high and so persistent, and whether improving character understanding would maybe help.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. As the Bardo would have said, it's the good apples in bad barrels, become bad apples. And then he talks about the barrel makers. If we have bad barrel makers, so the fact that I want to pick up on is that we have responsibility. It's humans that have responsibility for this system. It's regulators, it's boards of directors, it's senior leaders in organizations, it's us as educators in thinking about the system. Like, how can somebody listen to this podcast and not go back and say, wherever competence resides, character belongs? And I've got an accountability to think about that, because it's a risk factor for the organization and it's a risk factor for society. So we have an accountability, in to redesign these systems. So what we pick up is another article that will be coming out very soon is the old phrase that culture eats strategy for breakfast. Well, we're talking about character eats culture for breakfast. Culture will be a reflection of the character of the individuals in the organization. And so if we don't like our culture, let's look to our character, and particularly, Paul, the senior leaders of the organization. So one of the things that we really want to ensure is that from a strategic standpoint, one of the reasons that I started a Leader Character Associates with Bill Furlong was to create a consulting firm that would bring a strategic focus to embedding character in organizations. Understanding how do you adapt your HR practices, your selection, your performance management, how do you adapt your risk management? How do you enable character alongside the development of your culture in your organization and your strategy? So that architecture of the systems of the organization, absolutely. There'll be big headwinds against people with strong character if we don't course correct on them. But think about why we don't. It's more of a reflection of the people in the organization that aren't course correcting on character around those systems.
Well, we've got to this point in the conversation before you mentioned culture at all, so that's quite impressive in itself. But it relates what you've just said to my next question, really, which is I've long thought that it'd be better to talk about corporate character than corporate culture. And wouldn't it make a lot of sense to relate corporate character to the way we think about the organization and how we change it? So we can relate talking about leader character to the organizational character, well, and the character of the people in the organization, so that we might intentionally hire for character more robustly, I guess.
Yeah, it's that table that I talked about at the individual level, deficient and excess vice. We have a equivalent table at the organization level, and talking about the behaviors that would exemplify overweighting accountability, like lack of delegation, for example, or underweighting it, lack of taking ownership over issues. And I'm embarrassed to say, as somebody who worked in the field of strategy, where culture is a cornerstone, right? You think about what's the culture that needs to support the strategy. That I didn't see this earlier. 90% of what every organization wants, regardless of strategy, is a character-based culture. You look at the midline descriptions of our culture table, and again, we've talked to thousands of executives about it. They'd be delighted if that were the culture of their organization. And then it's very easy for them to understand that if they want to move the needle and get back to the midline, not the deficient, not the excess, we've met the enemy and it's us. We've got to work on our own character. So that's a beautiful place to say, how do you get culture transformation in an organization? Work on the character of the individuals. Now, we're back to the prior point that we still want to be saying, well, who are we promoting in the organization? Now, do we have if we're still, selecting and promoting on the basis of competence and we're not looking at character, we may then be, really getting those headwinds against what it is that we need to do to change our culture.
Yeah, it was actually a British philosopher that got me thinking about the importance of corporate character and the concept of corporate character, probably about 8 or 10 years ago now. And I was quite embarrassed then that as a strategist, I hadn't actually thought of that. But yeah, I think it's an area that's certainly worth exploring in great more detail, and I hope we will in the future. But in a similar vein, do you think we can apply the concept in understanding character in relation to teams and professions and places and regions or nations, and even maybe historical periods
I do think we can look at character and diagnose things that have gone well or not gone well. And and back to episodes of decisions. So we've got this other article that we have under review and say even with leaders like John F. Kennedy, are there episodes of good decision making, episodes of bad decision making, and understand, what was it about his character that might have helped us predict or understand that? What are those episodes of decision making? It is, I think it's a great opportunity, right, to look at these historical accounts. What I really like about character is its predictive quality. So in its behavior, we do behavioral forecasting with character, and you give a situation to say, okay, here's the situation, not what should somebody do, but if this is their configuration of character, what will they do? And people always land on the same kind of thing. It's saying, once we know what that configuration is, we know that this is the behavior forecasting will reveal these particular actions. And these actions are not the right ones that we want to be thinking about. They're dodging accountability, or they're, becoming frustrated and impatient and sidelining people. So we know what that forecast will lead to, which is what I really like then about character, is that it gives us something really tangible to work with to say, if these are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, what's the strength of character that we need to get there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that historians quite frequently talk about eras or episodes in history in relation to character of individuals in the period, but also character of the period. So I've been studying the Enlightenment, and they talk about the spirit of the age. And a lot of the way they talk about the spirit of the age is in terms of characteristics such as curiosity and courage is one of them, for example.
One of the things we found in our study as we're looking at militaries is that same idea, like their doctrines were developed or revised at different times, and why? What was it that triggered it? And the danger about some of these things is that the pendulum swings. And so now where it's all about curiosity or it's all about something, what I really like about character, it keeps our eye on. It's never all about one thing. If we think about these 11 dimensions of character and how they have to work together to be balanced, so think even about healthcare. We got into compassionate leadership. And then when we work in healthcare and they're going like, oh my gosh, that's led to burnout. Because where was the self-care in compassionate leadership, right? And so I think we can see, if we look at contextual influences, that we see all of this massive course correcting, which of course, again, we're seeing in the US right now. It's like pendulum swing this way, pendulum goes that way. We've got to resist that kind of quality of reasoning about what we do and go back to the foundations to say, if these are the things that hold up across time, context, religion, sector, culture, it's like the anatomy and physiology of the body. Let's not just say it's all about one thing, but really understand how all of these pieces fit together.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, as we're coming towards the end of the interview, I wanted to come to some really practical points. How would an organization go about embracing the ideas we've been discussing today, for example, in a leadership development program? And what would the process look like? Who would need to be involved, for example?
Hmm. That's the $1 million question that we always get, and we've tried to write a fair bit about this. So we have a Sloan Management Review article, "Make Leader Character Your Competitive Edge," and we have an Amplify article, "Cracking the Code," and then a book we wrote, "The Character Compass." So we've tried to put in the public domain ways of people beginning to understand this. Practically speaking, here's what it looks like. And we have this kind of diagram where we look at, we want to get beyond the temporary bump of developing awareness, creating a consciousness about something. Nice, but we have to get to that development. What are we going to do on a daily basis to develop our character? And how are we going to get the strategic impact of aligning it in organizations? We have landed on a methodology, which I think is pretty innovative, where, we've got to scale this massively and quickly. So one of the first ways we look at it is you've got to work with first of all, your senior leadership. If you're going to elevate character alongside competence, you're going to need the buy-in of your senior leaders, like that dean of the business school who says, of the medical school, I'm afraid of this. You can't be afraid of it. You've got to be saying, oh man, yeah, it's been a blind spot, but I can see how we can close the gap and I can see a roadmap and I know that we can do that. So we typically say, start with your senior leadership team to be able to get them on board. Those are usually between ideally 2 to 4 hour workshop, just introducing people to what character is. Often they'll do the self-assessment around character available through Sigma assessment systems to help them as they guide them through that process. Typically then they're like, yeah, all right, kick the tires on this. This is really important. You want to work on their development. And particularly with senior leaders, I would support it with executive coaching, but understand the executive coaches are people who need to understand character, not just competence in their coaching. So one of the things that we've done through Leader Character Associates is equip, coaches who understand character as well, so that they can support that development function. The piece that we find is really good around scaling is using the app. So for example, we're working with a group, Space Force group, Canadian, but operating in the US, where the senior leaders are on a program where they meet once a month for 90 minutes to go through each of the character dimensions once a month. They follow the social media on this. So month of February is on transcendence, if everybody wants to follow along. They're using the app in their development of character. And within the app, there's all of the supporting materials so that they can go back to their organization and train the trainer. So it's not about us going in to every organization to do that. So I talked earlier about subject matter expertise. I think the forefront about this is that we want to develop character in individuals, but equip them to pass the baton into organizations. We want to do that with teachers. Imagine this. If we were able to equip teachers in the same kind of methodology, use of the app, have this monthly session that's going to guide them in their character development, then they can think about it in their curriculum. How am I going to bring that to my students, regardless of the age that they're dealing with? My example is teaching strategy. So I'm always bringing character alongside competence in the teaching of strategy because I know what character is and I know strategic competence. So I can weave that into the architecture of the work that I do.
Okay, great. Another very practical question now, which is we've talked about hiring for character, but in the Forbes magazine that you published recently, you suggested that an individual's character isn't revealed through their resume or how they present themselves in an interview. that discovering someone's character is done by exploring who they are and how they become that person. And that is achieved through character conversations. Can you explain what you mean by character conversations? I know you went into it in some detail in another different article, which was in MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll share that and everything else that resource-wise we've talked about. But I wonder if you could just say something about that now.
Yeah, for sure. Selection is probably the area that a lot of people come to me to talk about. And if I misspoke in that article, it can be revealed in an interview, but not in the normal way. So we think about it as a character conversation. So here's the key thing, and we wrote another article quite a ways back because Canada Revenue Agency in Canada was one of the first organizations to begin to select on character as well as competence. They've been doing this probably for over 5-6 years now. And we wrote an article in Organization Dynamics describing what they did and how they did it. And again, in that Sloan Management Review article you mentioned around hiring and promoting for character, the key point I make is the actual practice of hiring for character is fundamentally dependent on our capacity to have developed our character ourselves. The more we are developing character, the more we see it in others, the more we can have a conversation where we're beginning to understand what character looks like in that conversation. And I'll get really practical about it. I've got this, when I'm helping equip people, coaching around this, I've got a video of a character based interview / conversation. And in it, I say to people, it's not a set of questions. It's not a structured question approach as you would be using in competence because you don't really know. You're exploring who this person is and what they're about with respect to character. And this particular interview, I start in one place, and what emerges is very quickly is the drive of this individual. Like anybody viewing it are like, whoa, this person has a lot of drive, right? They seem to have a lot of courage, a lot of accountability. Then I shift because you can see anybody looking at it, sees and observes the same thing. So I'm shifting my questions around exploring, well, what's the temperance and collaboration and humility, humanity to support that? The person starts responding in a particular area. In this case, she starts responding in areas that really reveal a fair bit around collaboration. And then you go like, wow, so she's got all this drive, but she's got this open-mindedness and flexibility. And it's like, wow, you can really see, but where's the self-care, right? Where's her in the midst of this? Again, questions that start to come around the temperance side. It's about a 7-minute video that I show people. They all see the same dimensions of character acting. And then I ask, what's the next question you would ask to see something that you haven't seen yet and that you want to see? And they all have great questions. So one of the challenges around what I've seen on character-based selection is people can see the same thing in an interview. The harder thing is to be the person in an improvisational way who's conducting an interview to explore that character dimensions of the individual. And to do that, that's what that dean of the medical school said he was afraid of. How do I know how to do this if I'm not working on it myself? But if we can understand these deficiencies in character and we know how to develop them, we could take on people like a Steve Jobs of the world, right? That you could say, I could cultivate his humility, humanity, and collaboration, and say, I'm not going to take the risks that are associated with those imbalances because I know I can develop them.
Higher levels of consciousness are absolutely necessary in the person doing the interviewing, and they've got to be up to speed with this themselves before they can apply it.
Yeah, it's a lived experience, and I hope that we understand consciousness more than just this cognitive awareness, into depth of lived experience of our habits to become that person who sees things this way.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm to my final question, which is how do we get this understanding of the importance of character and character development and so on a part of management education so that it can then be applied more effectively in organizations in the future?
We want to start with our educators. We start with our educators, and from there, they can then bring it to their students. And so I don't think, we wrote this in our Academy of Management Learning and Education article, is that you can have designated courses like we do at the business school, our engineering school now has had it, our law school at Western, on character development. We can have those courses for sure, but I think the twinning of character alongside competence is a really, just amazing place. So no matter what you're teaching, if you bring character on board, in my case, on my strategy class, it's hard sometimes to get them off of character because they begin to see that things like accountability and courage and justice and humanity are going to fundamentally influence the strategic decisions, and that we've got to keep our eye on those things. And,
Yeah.
Paul, for those that are maybe on the technical side of things, I really like this article we wrote in IEEE looking at engineering. So my son had been one of the leads in the Formula Race team at Western University, and we did this character-based workshop at the beginning of the race season. They design, manufacture, race car every year. And what we wrote in that article was a case study and a journey of how the elevation of character transformed their engineering competence to actually elevate their performance. They went to top 10 in the world within a year. And this is 500 engineering schools around the world trying to do the same thing. And for them, they wanted to be pioneers in the industry. They wanted to be, a team that operated differently than anybody else. And they began to activate on their character in the process of the work that they were doing, developing this car. And quite frankly, I watched all of them. They were forever transformed, which I think is the most exciting part of it. Their character was strengthened in service of the lofty aspirations that they had.
Well, that speaks to motivation, I guess, as much as anything else. They had a very high level of motivation to want to learn, change, and improve. And that's an interesting character trait in itself. But I think the many people that are in systems thinking that we reach as part of what we do will be very interested in what you've just said, because it links to the soft systems approach to systems thinking. Um, and so I thank you very much for the interview today. And also, we'll be picking up on some of these things in the next interview in the Salon series, which will be with Mary Gentili, another Mary. I think you know Mary Gentili
Yes,
already, yeah?
I've had her in my class teaching. I said, oh,
Yeah.
I'll better have the world expert on values. And so, yeah, she's terrific work.
Speaking truth to power, I think is one of the core elements of what she's going to be talking about, which obviously requires some of the character traits like courage that we've been talking about today. So that's why I wanted Mary to be the next person I interview. It'll be a natural flow from this conversation, I think. Okay, so thanks very much for your time today. Was there anything I missed that you wanted to say before we finish completely?
I think, Paul, this if people are left with even something like Mary Gentili's work, because we do pick up on courage workshops, people want the courage to speak truth to power. How can they become the person who develop those muscles? So if we keep our eye on the roots of the tree system,
Yeah.
and that there is possibility, we know a lot about how to develop character. So I really like this. Is like back in the day when we talk about nutrition and exercise, and it's not just a pie in the sky, but there is actual work that we can do to feed ourselves better nutritionally, to exercise better, and to become, individuals and organizations that are up to the challenges that we need to be in this world.
Perfect. Okay, that's a very good point to end on, I think. Thanks very much indeed.
My pleasure, Paul.